Hey everyone, my name is Sean Wheeler. I'm a co-founder of AMP. We are an AI native CRM. I'll talk more about what that means in a little bit. Today I want to talk about what you do when A/B tests aren't enough. A/B tests are a standard method that a lot of people use to make decisions. I want to talk about why at AMP we decided they actually were not a good basis for making decisions for the use case we were looking at, and what we built instead. So let me talk really briefly about what AMP does. We are, like I said, we're an AI native CRM. CRM sends messages to people. There are a lot of choices that are involved in making those messages go. What timing, what channel, what inventory you're going to talk about, the tone you're going to use, what value propositions you're going to use to frame it. Even copy decisions like what emoji do you put in. All of those are decisions you have to make. We make it easy to make those decisions by trying lots and lots of different options. We have tooling that makes it easy for you to write not just 10 or 20, but thousands of different messages that embody all of these different choices. We send those out in massive parallel experiments, and then we learn from the responses we get to those messages. It's that last point, the learning, that I want to emphasize, because that is also what A/B tests purport to do, is you learn from user behavior. And that is, I think, an important insight, is that if you really want to learn what works, you have to own the data generating process. You can't just say, oh, well, machine learning can look at our historical data and tell us what to do. We've had customers, for instance, a food delivery app in Southeast Asia that we started sending with them, and then they wrote us a little bit panicked and said, you're sending messages to some people at like 11:30 at night. What's going on there? We never send messages that late. And when we looked into it, we discovered that we had identified a niche market for them, which was people who work night shifts in call centers. These people did not want to go out and wander the streets looking for some place to eat that late at night, but they were hungry. And so pinging them with a message at that time actually got them to respond. That customer had never considered that niche audience before, and nothing in their historical data would have identified it for them because they had never tried finding them. They had never tried sending a message at that time, so they had nothing for the algorithm to learn. It was only through the experimentation that we could do that. So we ended up building not just an A/B testing system, but a full reinforcement learning system. And in fact, even went a little bit beyond what a lot of those systems do. You don't have to understand anything on this slide. I've put it up here just because I want you to appreciate how hard it was to build. I'm going to talk about some of these aspects, but mostly talk about them in terms of why they weren't just, in our opinion, better than A/B tests. It's actually why they were necessary. We couldn't survive with just A/B tests. We needed more. So, A/B tests are often talked about as the quote-unquote gold standard in making decisions. That's a phrase that's used often. But at the same time that people talk about that gold standard, they'll also talk about how a lot of people are skeptical. Even after they have implemented A/B testing, they wonder how much value they're really getting from it. They wonder if it's going in the right direction. And it's not surprising that people would think that. If you look at medical studies, which are the ideal of A/B tests, the whole idea of an A/B test is based on the practice of a randomized control trial. You can find, and this is one particular example, if you Google replication crisis, you can find a lot more. But this plot on the right is a whole bunch of medical studies showing the degree to which particular food choices either cause or protect against cancer. And each, as you can see by where the dots lie relative to that middle vertical bar, there are studies that show it both ways. There are studies that show that it causes cancer, show very heavy evidence that it influences cancer, and there are other studies that show the exact opposite, that it in fact protects against it. This isn't because these studies were run poorly, although that is always a problem, and in fact it's a problem people often underestimate when they get some out-of-the-box A/B testing tool that comes with their CRM system or their survey tool or something, and they go, oh, well, I can just randomly assign people, and then I run my A/B test, and it gives me good decisions. There's a lot that goes into A/B testing, into an experimental design, that a lot of businesses, frankly, don't look into too much. And because of that, they let their A/B test lie to them a lot. But even if we assume that none of those are problems, say you've taken care of that, you have people who know what they're doing. No A/B test tells you the expiration date on its results. There are statistical measures that try to get at reliability. Those also don't work. P-values don't tell you how reliable, how likely an experiment is to replicate. So when you test A versus B and find that A performs better, A might not perform better tomorrow. There's no way for you to know that without running the A/B test again and see if A is still performing better. A/B tests are expensive to run. And so running them over and over and over again is often just not an option. In fact, if you run A/B tests over and over and over again, you're no longer doing A/B tests. You're doing a Bandit algorithm, which is the better way of doing things. An A/B test, you look at A versus B, A wins, and you say, okay, we're going to go with A. A Bandit algorithm, on the other hand, says, okay, we have A versus B. We're going to keep running that. We're never going to turn, there's not going to be a stage where we turn off this experiment. It just keeps running. And if recently A has performed twice as well as B, well, the next time we have to make a decision about whether to show a user A or B, they should have twice as high a chance of getting A. This is how companies like Netflix choose what thumbnails to show when you're browsing their app. They'll go through and they will change them over time based on what is getting a better response. Bandit algorithms are the better way of making decisions because they address this core problem of durability, which is a problem A/B testing simply cannot address. Now, standard Bandit architecture, I'm not going to go into too much detail on this. You can Google multi-arm Bandit. You can find lots of this stuff. But you have your treatment options. Same way as you have an A/B test, you can have more than just A and B. You can have lots of treatment options. You go through, you run them, and you aggregate the performance. A performs so well, B performs a little worse, C performs better than both of them, things like that. You then proportionally assign next treatments based on the performance, the historical performance so far, and you see the user responses, and you feed that back in. So there's a constant loop of trying things out, assigning them proportionally, seeing the responses, and then changing the proportions based on those responses. I do want to be upfront that A/B testing is not like if you just switch over to Bandit algorithms and you're gonna be better off. There is an upfront cost to running Bandit algorithms, mostly in infrastructure. There are a lot of different things that can impact your ability to implement Bandit infrastructure because it is not a manual process. There is no point at which you turn to someone and say, okay, run the Bandit again and let's update it. That's an A/B test. Bandits require you to go through and create all of the algorithmic and data storage and instrumentation infrastructure to be able to automatically assign next treatments based on historical data. So we knew we needed this for messaging because we couldn't say for each individual user, hey, here's what they like right now. Go write a message for them and send it to them. That does not scale. We knew we needed a Bandit, but we knew we needed more than just a regular Bandit because we did need a higher level of personalization. It wouldn't do much good to say, here's how everyone on your app performed, and if you look at everyone on the app, A performs better than B, therefore you should give more A's. That's making a lot of decisions for a lot of individual users based on a single aggregate measure. That's just not a very robust way of making decisions. What we needed was what's called a contextual Bandit, where you switch out doing these aggregations and you actually model them instead. So you can give users different attributes, whether they're a new user or a returning user, or based on their geography, or things they've done in the app, whatever you think is important. And based on those characteristics, it can then generate a probability that they will respond. This allows you to get an individualized assignment. This is true personalization. A lot of times people talk about personalization and messaging in terms of, we'll put their name in the message. That's inserting something into a field. It's not personalization. Personalization is when you make individual decisions about what people want and when they want it, and then send it according to those rules. So a contextual bandit gets us to personalization, where we can see which messaging choices tend to correspond with people doing more of a particular behavior that we care about, such as clicking or buying or watching a video or whatever it is our customer wants to worry about. So we took all this and said, okay, great. We're ready to go. We can personalize. And we quickly discovered a problem that is with contextual bandits that is largely unsolved in the research literature if you look into it, and that is that all bandits, and in a lot of cases this is actually true of A/B testing as well. They're driven by what some people call reward maximization, other people call it regret minimization. It all amounts to the same thing, which is you identify something you care about, clicks, watches, purchases, and you want to get as many of those things as you can. Now, that makes a lot of sense when you're using a bandit like Netflix uses it, where you have to show some thumbnail. You're not going to show people nothing when they go on the app. And so it's just a matter of choosing what's the best thing to show them. But in messaging, you actually have the choice to show them nothing. You could not send the message. And sending messages that shouldn't be sent actually carries long-term costs. They could uninstall your app. They could turn off notifications. Even if they don't do something that drastic, you could actually train them to simply ignore all communication from you. It beeps on their screen. They just swipe it off. They never pay attention to it. Any of those durably, in some cases, permanently remove the influenceability of that user. That is not something you want, and it is a constant struggle in messaging. So we needed a bandit that could do the adaptation and personalization we wanted, but could do it in a way that would maximize the good stuff that our customers wanted while minimizing the chances of that durable downside. There aren't good solutions for this out there in the research right now. There are some where it's like, well, you can look at multiple goals. You could train it to have several goals, and one of these goals can be to not uninstall. But that's a longer term behavior, and it gets very difficult technically to match that in with short term behavior of they actually watch the video after the thing. There's other people who have ideas saying, well, you should just give quotas that you can't send more than, 7 messages a week to a user. But that ignores that number is going to be too low for some users and too high for others. There are some users who will tolerate 30 messages a week. There are other users who will tolerate exactly 1 and no more. And if you just go in there and set it and say, well, I'm just going to say this for everyone, that defeats the purpose of using experimentation to learn anyway. So we needed to solve this problem of how do we make sure that we are balancing a desire to maximize upside with a concurrent desire to minimize downside. We did this through a method that we have in a preprint on archive. You can go there and look at it if you want the details, but it mostly comes down to this figure that you can see on the screen right now, which is a windowing procedure for developing a dynamic control group. Normally, people will take control groups and they'll say, oh, it's a holdout group. We just won't mess with them at all. That's not actually what we want. We don't want to know how our messaging performs to people who we never talk to. We want to know how our messaging performs to people who we could have talked to right now but didn't. That's a different population. So what we do is we peg it all to an individual message that we send. That's the blue dot that you can see on here. We send a message at a particular time. We implement a monitoring window after the message, that's the blue rectangle, where we look to see whether they did the thing that our customer cares about, such as making a purchase. We create an exclusion zone around that. It's a 72-hour exclusion zone by default. It's 24 hours before, it's the day before, the day of, and the day after we send the message. We have that. We set that exclusion zone, and then we set an inclusion zone for the 7 days before the exclusion zone. What we do is for each message, we pick a bunch of users who were sent a message in the inclusion zone in those 7 days of open period, but were not sent any messages during the exclusion zone. So they didn't receive anything that might muddy the waters of our measurement. We then randomly pick one of those users and assign it to that message and pretend that we sent that message to that control user. We don't actually send it. We just switch out the user IDs and then monitor for that user for that time period and say, what did they do? There's a little bit more detail to that where we actually will take engagement level and conversion level and what messages they've received and match on those as well. Those are all icing on the cake. I highly recommend them, but they're not essential to the method. They just make it work better. The idea is what you're doing is for each message you send, you are finding a user who was not influenced during that one time period, and you pretend that you sent the treatment to them. What that does is gives you a counterfactual for every treatment you could send. So you could send a message at Monday at 9 a.m. You could send a message at Wednesday at noon. But you could also, those are different choices, and you want to know which one of those is better. That's what a contextual bandit does. What a counterfactual bandit does is it says you could send a message at Monday at 9 o'clock or Wednesday at noon, or you could not send a message at Monday at 9 o'clock. It creates a new, among your A's and B's and C's and D's of your tests, it creates a not A, a not B. So what that allows us to do is measure the incremental value of making particular decisions. Because what we want is to find choices that give us not just value, but value above baseline. So we've actually found this with a lot of apps. In fact, a lot of CRM tools, I hate to name names, but I will. Braze does this, where they have what they call an intelligent timing feature, where they say, look, they'll figure out when to send messages to each of your users. And as near as I can tell, the way they do that is they look at when those users are on the app, and then they say, look, this is when they're usually on the app, you should send them a message then. For most apps, that's actually the exact wrong time to send a message. If you're a food app and your users normally come in and order food on Friday evenings, there's no point in sending them a message on Friday evenings to buy food. They were already going to do that. In fact, you could be hurting yourself if your message includes a discount code, because then you are paying them to do what they were going to do anyway. If they normally come and order food on Friday evenings, what you really want to do is discover that, in fact, if you nudge them to do it, they will also buy food on Wednesday afternoons. And they didn't do that before, but now they do because you're reminding them to. Those are the opportunities where you really want to use messaging. That's where you're adding value. So what we do is we use our counterfactual contextual bandit to discover that normally maybe they have a 20% chance of coming to the app on Wednesdays at noon, but if we send them this particular message, they have a 50% chance. That's a 94% chance of influenceability, and that influence is really what we care about. So you can see how these scores, each of these graphs show the baseline and the target predictions for timing for a particular e-commerce app that we work with. You can see how these scores evolve over the life cycle of a user. For new users, most of the scores tend to be aggregated right along the diagonal of these graphs. It's going from the bottom left to top right. That's where the baseline and the target prediction are pretty much the same, which our system interprets as it's a coin toss. It might influence them if you do this at this time, it might not. Most of them are there, but you see, even with new users, you start getting some differentiation. Some cases where you see, okay, this user, this time doesn't work for them, or this user, this time really does seem to influence them. As users become more active, you see this spreads out a lot more, and the system becomes more confident that what situations users are influenceable in. If users then become inactive, they stop coming to the app, because we have stored these measures of what characteristics, the contextual part of the contextual bandit, which characteristics tend to result in added value, the system retains a sort of long-term memory of what works and what doesn't. It tends to gray out some of those memories, says, I'm not going to put as much weight on them because we haven't seen them, so we don't have updated information, but it doesn't just forget them once they leave. So this allows us to make decisions very much like you would make decisions if you were investing money in stocks. If you went to a wealth manager who wanted you to give them your money so they could invest on your behalf, and you said, well, how are you going to invest it? And they said, well, there's one company right here. We're going to put all of your money in that company. You say, why only that one company? They said, well, we looked at that company and lots of other companies over the last year, and that company performed best. So that's the one we're going to do. That's a terrible investment strategy. You should never, ever give your money to a wealth manager who says that's how they're going to work. And yet that is exactly how A/B tests work. That is what A/B tests do. They say, well, at this particular time when we ran the test, this one performed better. Therefore, that's where we're going to put all of our eggs into. That's a bad idea. With a Bandit, you can go through and constantly hedge your bets. Something performs a little bit better, great. Move a few more people over into that choice. Something performs a little bit worse, well, maybe back off of that. Don't do it as much. If you have a counterfactual contextual bandit, then you can do that based not only on how much people are doing the things you want, but also how much they are expected to do that thing if they weren't going to do it anyway. It allows you to look at to make decisions based on the influenceability of users given different choices you make about messaging. So with this kind of system, evaluation isn't nearly as straightforward as it is with an A/B test, because there is no pre and post period. You can't say, well, here's what they did before the test, here's what they did after the test, here's the difference. What you can do is look at these scores that the system uses to make these decisions, and you can bin them, and you can see here, for example, you can see the control performance and the test performance, and you can see that in many cases we were 2xing, 3xing the performance of users, where the system had been able to find a strong preference for them. But maybe the best illustration for me, at least personally, of how I know the system works is this is an actual graph from one of our customers, where they had used our system for a while. And there had been tons of learning across several different countries worth of users. And then they had a change in leadership, and there were some financial struggles, and their leadership said, no, what is this thing called AMP? They said, well, we use it to send messages. And they said, no, we don't want to pay for that. Get rid of it. So they came to us and they said, I'm kind of worried about this. My boss says I have to get rid of it, but I'm kind of scared about what that's going to do. So could you just take all of our best performing messages and turn those off and leave kind of the lower impact messages there, so the learning is still going on, but at least we can then kind of see what's going to happen when we turn this off. And he said, in the meantime, we're going to take all of these messages that you turn off and we're going to implement them in Braze as campaigns. So we're going to try to do manually what AMP is doing automatically. And you can see here on the graph where they tried to do that. And you can see on the graph 3 weeks later where they texted us and said, everyone's freaking out. The numbers are dropping. Turn it all back on. And we said, I thought you said they didn't have the money. He said, that's what I told them. I said, I went to my boss and said, you told me that you didn't have the money. And he says, we have the money for this. Turn it back on. So this, I would not recommend testing AMP in this particular way. I think there are less expensive ways to test AMP, but the system creates enough bottom line value that in this case the executives were actually able to see it, not in any particular graphs we were showing them. They saw on their side, they saw the volume dropping when they stopped doing this constant adaptive optimization of their messaging. So I want to spend just the last couple minutes talking about why people do focus so much on A/B tests. Because, I mean, if you look out there, A/B tests, they are table stakes for any kind of messaging system, for any kind of survey system. If you don't have an A/B test capability in there, then people are like, why are you even in the game? And people are often, that's kind of one of the first things they say is when you say, we have to make this decision, they're like, well, can we A/B test it? I applaud that intuition that when people say we have to make a decision, they want to test it. But why specifically A/B tests? Why is that system so very popular, whereas other ways of doing things like a Bandit approach, which are clearly better in pretty much all regards, Why are those things that people don't turn to as much? I think there are primarily three reasons. And I admit that I'm coming to this from a biased perspective. But there is a matter of decision paralysis. You have, it's like, okay, we have three different proposals, and one of them comes from my boss, and I think his plan really stinks, but I can't tell my boss that to his face. So what can we do to make this, like, to give up the other plans a shot? Well, we can test it. Let's test it, and then we'll go with the tests. So there is that. There is blame deflection. You don't want, if you say, okay, your boss's plan lost the test, your plan won, but now it's 2 months later and the numbers are not right, and your boss is mad, and he's saying, why did you do that thing? You can say, well, the test told us to. It's not my fault. The test told us. There's also just habit. A/B testing is what everyone else does. It's just a common thing. It's become a habit. None of these are good reasons. The first two, decision paralysis and blame deflection, those are cultural problems in an organization. If organizationally you don't have a way of working out disagreements, even absent data, or if you don't have the safety to be able, that you actually feel you do have to deflect blame, no amount of A/B testing is going to solve that. And in fact, it shuffles those problems under the rug. Habit, I feel a little bit more sympathetic to, but it's still not a good reason. A/B tests became the gold standard back when people were still driving in horse-drawn carriages. There are a lot of things that we have been doing since people were driving in horse-drawn carriages that we don't do anymore because we have better ways of doing things. In fact, most of us don't ride in horse-drawn carriages anymore because there are other ways of doing things. A/B testing is insisting on driving a horse-drawn carriage when there are cars available. In fact, when there are rocket ships available. It doesn't make sense. So, that is all I have. I am happy to answer any questions about what we're doing at AMP, questions about the architecture we created, or anything else. Thank you for your time. I hope you have enjoyed listening to this as much as I have enjoyed talking about it.